The 1492 Crucible, Ambition, Shipwreck, and the Shockwaves of Discovery. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely skipping that standard, polished textbook summary of Christopher Columbus you probably learned in school. Instead, we're plunging straight into a living, breathing, high-stakes mystery. We're going to experience 1492 as it really was, a world of immense uncertainty, where outcomes were totally unknown, risks were absolutely fatal, and global history literally hung by a thread.
So how did a repeatedly rejected navigator, a desperate monarchy, and a catastrophic midnight shipwreck accidentally reshape the world? We really have to explore how a man who was turned away by Portugal and initially Spain itself ended up sparking a collision that altered the human trajectory forever. Because when we peel back the mythology, this just wasn't a story of grand, flawless design or inevitable progress. Not at all. It was a chaotic cocktail of human ambition, economic desperation, and pure, unbelievable chance.
Part 1, The High-Stakes Royal Gamble, Desperation and the Capitulations of Santa Fe. Okay, let's set the scene. It's early 1492. The Spanish monarchs were flush with victory in Granada, but they were economically desperate to bypass Portugal's absolute lock on the lucrative spice trade. Yet, they still rejected Columbus's deeply flawed geographical math. I mean, Columbus was literally packing his bags for France when Louis de Santangel, a royal treasurer, intervened. He pitched the sheer geopolitical glory that could be won, and remarkably, he advanced the majority of the funding himself, entirely interest-free. Talk about a massive gamble, right? But there is a fascinating, hidden motive behind that money. This wasn't just about spices or imperial expansion. Santangel was actually part of a highly vulnerable network of conversos. These were Jewish converts to Christianity who were terrified of the escalating, brutal Spanish Inquisition. By funding Columbus, he was actively trying to establish a transatlantic sanctuary. It's this profound layer of human survival driving a massive geopolitical event. Just incredible. And look at the unprecedented authority Columbus secured from these desperate monarchs in April of 1492. The capitulations of Santa Fe represent a staggering transfer of power. In exchange for taking on this massive risk, Columbus demanded and actually got a 10% cut of all riches, sweeping hereditary titles like Viceroy and Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and the honorific Don. It was this almost feudal level of decentralization granted to a commoner, setting the absolute perfect stage for decades of fierce conflict. Moving on to Part 2, Navigating the Terrifying Unknown, Terror, Mutiny, and Dead Reckoning. For this, we have to strip away our modern understanding of the globe. Imagine the sheer, visceral terror of sailing off the edge of known maps into the vast, pitch-dark Atlantic, because precise tools like astrolabes were completely useless on those pitching, rolling wooden vessels. They survived entirely by dead reckoning. To calculate speed, they'd throw a piece of flotsam over the forward rail, and a pilot would start a quick, rhythmic chant. The exact syllable he reached when the wood passed the stern, that was their speed. They literally staked their lives on a song in the middle of a terrifyingly empty ocean. And to track time in that terrifying emptiness, they relied entirely on this frighteningly fragile instrument, the ampeletta. This half-hour sandglass required constant, unblinking monitoring. Exhausted, seasick cabin boys had to turn it day and night, without fail. If they missed a single turn or dozed off for just a few minutes in the pitch black of the lower decks, the entire navigational map would warp. One slip-up could potentially doom the whole fleet to the abyss. As you'd expect, the psychological toll was immense, escalating week by grueling week. By September 23rd, a terrifying dead calm hits. The ships just stall completely in the water. The crew genuinely believes they've sailed into a part of the ocean with no wind at all, meaning they'll never get home. Paranoia completely fractures the leadership. It culminates in November when Columbus's own seasoned captain, Martin Alonso Pinzon, actively defies orders, abandons the fleet with the Pinta, and sails off out of pure greed. Which brings us to Part 3, Collision of Two Worlds, Geographic Delusions, and the Taino. When they finally make landfall on October 12th, we witness a collision defined by deeply flawed European perceptions. Columbus was operating under a complete geographical delusion. He had fundamentally miscalculated the Earth's circumference. So, standing right there on a beach in the Caribbean, he was utterly, genuinely convinced he was in the Indian Ocean, on the outskirts of China. This immense error is exactly why he mistakenly and enduringly labeled the indigenous people as Indians.
Now, in his journals, Columbus arrogantly wrote the indigenous population off as simple and easily conquered, just because they lacked iron. But he was entirely blind to the reality right in front of him. The Taino possessed a highly advanced, complex society. They operated within organized chiefdoms led by hereditary leaders, practiced advanced agriculture, crafted profound religious art, and navigated the Caribbean in massive dugout canoes. That initial encounter was defined by a tragic, monumental blindness to a rich, thriving civilization.
Part 4. Midnight Disaster on the Reef, the Crash of the Santa Maria.
Now, this brings us to a moment of sheer historical accident that forced the creation of the first European colony in the Americas. Forget grand, calculated colonial blueprints. It's Christmas Eve, 1492. Columbus hasn't slept in 48 hours. The sea is deceptively calm. Exhausted beyond measure, he finally lets his guard down and retires to his cabin to rest. So what happens when an exhausted admiral closes his eyes in uncharted waters? Well, the disaster unfolds in minutes. Columbus goes to sleep at 11 p.m. Seeing the admiral retire, the watch officer also decides to abandon his post, handing the heavy tiller to a young, entirely inexperienced cabin boy. At midnight, the silence is broken. The flagship, the Santa Maria, silently but firmly crushes onto a jagged coral reef off the coast of Hispaniola. The massive timber splinters, the damage is completely irreversible. Suddenly, Columbus is completely stranded without his flagship. Out of pure necessity, he's forced to use the ship's wreckage to build a crude fort, working with the local Taino chief. He accidentally founds the settlement of La Navida with 39 men simply because they literally cannot fit on the remaining, much smaller vessel. So, that crucial point, the very first Spanish footprint in the New World wasn't a strategic conquest. It was a desperate, accidental survival tactic born entirely from a shipwreck. Finally, Part 5. Propaganda and endless lawsuits, spinning the narrative and multi-generational fallout. Columbus now faces a massive political nightmare. He has to return to Spain missing his flagship, dealing with a mutinous captain, and surviving a terrifying winter storm in the mid-Atlantic that nearly sinks his remaining vessel. So how does he survive the fallout? He writes a masterful piece of propaganda. In his widely published 1493 letter, he boldly claims, "All of which I took possession for our highnesses, with proclaiming herald and flying royal standards, and no one objecting." Notice what he conveniently leaves out? No mention of the catastrophic shipwreck, no mention of Pinzon abandoning him. He crafts an immaculate myth of glorious discovery just to guarantee funding for a second voyage. But as we see here, reality quickly caught up with the myth. Columbus proved to be a disastrous, tyrannical governor. By 1500, due to reports of gross mismanagement and brutality, a royal administrator actually arrested him. The admiral of the Ocean Sea was literally shipped back to Spain in chains. Stripped of his absolute power, his massive downfall sparked the Pleitos Colombinos, decades of bitter, multi-generational lawsuits over his wealth and contested legacy. In the highest courts of Spain, a fierce battle for the historical narrative began. Columbus claimed to be the sole visionary, the undisputed hero of the crown. But the family of Martín Alonso Pinzón, the captain who mutinied, waged a relentless legal war. They argued that Pinzón, the highly respected veteran navigator, was the true military force who kept the frightened crew together and actually saved the expedition. It just brilliantly illustrates that history is rarely written by just one person without a serious fight. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider. We so often view history as this straight, inevitable line of progress. But when you realize that the collision of two hemispheres and the very foundation of the modern world hinged on an exhausted captain going to sleep and a teenage boy steering a ship onto a reef in the pitch dark, well, it begs the question. If the foundation of the modern world hinged on those mistakes, what other historical inevitabilities were actually just chaotic accidents? Thank you so much for exploring this reality with me on this explainer.